Greetings, everyone. My name is Danny Anderson, president at Trinity University. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's Policymaker Lecture series. It's now in its 39th year of bringing you speakers who are knowledgeable, notable, and newsworthy. We're excited to bring this programming to you live over the Tiger Network, which streams live content as well as on-demand access to webinars, lectures, and the performing arts. I encourage you to check it out at trinity.edu/live. Before I introduce our guest lecturer, I want to extend a special welcome and thank you to our Trinity University business affiliates who are joining us virtually today. Ranging from small local businesses to multinational corporations, our corporate and foundation donors ensure support for our Tigers and their quest for lifelong learning. Today's speaker is Anja Manuel, who will lend her insight into President Biden's U.S. foreign policy vision and our country's role in the world. Ms. Manuel's extensive experience as a former State Department diplomat gives her a unique perspective into a rapidly changing and polarized world. Ms. Manuel is a principal and co-founder of RiceHadleyGates and Manuel, LLC, a strategic consulting firm that advises U.S. companies in navigating international markets. Her fellow partners include former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, former National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley, and former Defense Secretary Robert Gates. She is the author of the critically acclaimed This Brave New World, India, China, and the United States. The book explores the emergence of China and India as leading global superpowers and the implications for the United States and the rest of the world. Her rational and measured approach to the issues has established her as an informed resource for audiences around the world. This lecture will be moderated by Dr. Lauren Turek, who has recently been promoted to Associate Professor of History at Trinity University. Dr. Turek is a diplomatic historian by training and has research interest in the history of U.S. foreign relations, religion, and the international human rights movement. Ms. Manuel will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open things up to your questions. You can submit questions using the comment section on Facebook or YouTube, or by emailing tigernetwork@trinity.edu. And now I'll turn things over to Anja Manuel. Anja.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, President Anderson and Lauren. I just wish I could be with everyone who's there in person. These things are always much more fun when we can interact and chat afterwards and before, but alas, we're 1 year in on Zoom. So I think Lauren and I, when we were talking before, thought we might just turn this into more of a chat. So I don't know, Lauren, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, I would love to. And again, welcome, Anja. We're so glad to have you. I'd love to get started by having you tell us a little bit about what you think might be going on with the Biden administration in terms of its foreign policy priorities. The administration is really just getting settled. We would love to hear you start us off with a little bit of your sense of what their priorities will be for our U.S. foreign policy.
Absolutely. Thanks for starting with that. So far, I would say the Biden foreign policy has been moderate and competent. It's just been, I would say, a really good running start. You know, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Kurt Campbell, Janet Yellen, Gina Raimondo, a lot of the folks that President Biden has put into these key posts are, they're not far left or far right. They're moderate voices. They have a lot of experience that they bring to the posts that they now hold. And you asked about priorities. It's one priority: get out of COVID and build back our economy. And you hear that. It's pretty unusual. I mean, you and I, you study history of foreign relations. It's pretty unusual to have the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State out there every day saying, our goal in foreign policy is to build a better America for middle-class America. This needs to be a foreign policy for Americans, which I've been really encouraged that that's what I'm hearing from them. And of course, the priorities are not hidden. It's building back the economy, getting out of COVID, managing the rise of China. That doesn't mean having a conflict of China. We'll talk about that in a minute. working on responsibly extracting ourselves from these long conflicts in Afghanistan and in the Middle East, and climate change. You know, when you have the former Secretary of State, John Kerry, sitting in the same building as the current Secretary of State as climate envoy, you know you're giving that a huge amount of heft and priority. And I think you're about to see a lot more of that being rolled out in the coming weeks.
You've mentioned a lot of names that are surely familiar to our audience, and I would love to even go a little deeper and think about this assortment of folks who Biden has appointed to these positions and how their personalities might interact in terms of the way in which they will attempt to implement these priorities, targeting COVID, thinking about managing the relationship with China, building America back, as he was saying, build back better. Can you talk a little bit about personality in foreign policy, especially at that next level, below the president?
Of course. Yeah, I know some of them personally, not all of them. So I'm speaking partly on what I hear publicly, but this is a group that's pretty collegial. This is not a team of rivals. The new Secretary of Defense, General Lloyd Austin, is probably the least close to the rest of the group, but I would say Tony Blinken, Kath Hicks, who's the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Jake Sullivan, a lot of the senior folks who are coming into the White House, which of course has been staffed up first. Wendy Sherman is one level below. She's the Deputy Secretary of State. Toria Nuland. All of these people have known each other and worked together in various capacities for decades at times. So I think you have a team that, to the extent they're able, is hitting the ground running in a really positive way. Now, let me annotate that. It is hard to get people in posts when they have to be Senate confirmed. So you're seeing, in fact, I think there were some news stories out this week. Wow, there's, not a lot of people have been confirmed. There's the way this works for those of us in the audience who aren't, from Washington and living this every day. In the White House, people just need a security clearance and they don't need to be confirmed by the Senate. So what you've seen is the National Security Council staff up pretty quickly. They had a lot of those roles understood and pretty much filled during inauguration or soon thereafter. In state, defense, treasury, commerce, justice, all of those, you've got usually the secretary and the deputy secretary in place now, but everything below that is in various stages of vetting, internal vetting, congressional vetting, and then waiting to get hearings and getting them actually in seats. And what happens is you can't move forward very effectively because you have a lot of people who are acting. And you're going to start the foreign policy really accelerate and the momentum get going as you get people in those positions in the next couple months.
Wonderful. Okay, that's really helpful to hear. Before we start to talk about perhaps relations with China or other main countries, I'd love to talk a little bit about the COVID-19 response, because as you noted, that's a real priority for the Biden administration. So if you don't mind telling us a little bit about how maybe different regions of the world are faring in their approach to dealing with COVID-19 in terms of politics or economics, what you see unfolding, what are the real issues in terms of COVID-19 that the Biden administration will be trying to tackle as they move forward with that big priority?
Yeah, great question, because of course that is priority number 1, 2, and 3. And my business partners, Condi Rice and Bob Gates, Steve Hadley, and I sometimes joke that last year we saw the revenge of the nation state. That is what COVID created in the world system. We talk a good game. We're in the United Nations. We're in the WHO, all of these other things. President Trump had much more hawkish views on some of those and wasn't as supportive as I think you're going to see the Biden administration being. But when push came to shove, even Schengen was suspended for a while, the idea that Europeans can travel freely, right? You're seeing vaccine nationalism. Not just originally, I think there was worry that there would be vaccine nationalism from the Trump administration, but you've seen it all across Europe with Ursula von der Leyen saying, well, why are you sending this out? You now see it with India. The Serum Institute is one of the biggest manufacturers of vaccines in the world. They're in India. And Prime Minister Modi just said, not so fast. We're going to take care of our own people before we take care of everyone else. So if there's one theme for what happened last year with COVID, it is that nation states stuck with nation states, and global cooperation was unfortunately pretty much out of the window. You asked how different regions are coming out of it. That's a very wise question because it's been enormously different. Asia, by and large, is faring much better than everyone else. They locked down very early. They had experience with this from SARS and other coronaviruses. I think there's a natural community understanding of masking and the instinct that you're just going to be safe by wearing masks and things. And there's now some studies are coming out that say that Asians may have a little bit more natural immunity because so many more coronaviruses have already been circulating there. So huge shutdowns very early. The most famous one, of course, is in China. I wish I had a slide to show you, but I show these pictures to my students in my class of Wuhan just completely shut down. A traffic circle that would normally have thousands of cars in it at a time, no one. You know, people getting their temperature checked and wearing full garbage bags because that's how they thought they had to protect themselves from the virus. And when they said lockdown, they mean do not leave your house for a month, right? The lockdowns here were nothing by comparison. You just can't do that in a democratic society. So what's happened? The Asian economies bounced back much faster, not just China, but also Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan to a lesser extent. A lot of them never ended into full recession territory. They actually grew a little bit even last year. And in the second half that accelerated, and now they're growing fast. The flip side, I would say that the region that's worst hit that people hardly talk about is Latin America. 6 out of 10 countries with the highest COVID death rates per capita are in Latin America. A lot of leaders there reacted slowly or hesitantly. You know, you've heard a lot of uproar with AMLO in Mexico, and to an even bigger extent, Bolsonaro in Brazil, where he's now getting a huge, pushback from his own people and his own business community saying, come on, people are still dying here. And not as much room for stimulus as Europe and the US did. We put in place enormous fiscal stimulus. I don't know what we're up to now, but it's something like 20% of GDP. It could be even higher. In Latin America, you don't have room for that because you have high debt burdens, a social safety net that isn't really working, a healthcare system that isn't strong. So if you look at the predicted growth rates for Latin America, you may still very well see a recession this year. I think those are the two biggest regional differences I see, with everyone else in the world kind of somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. What about Africa? Because that's a region of the world that we don't usually get to hear as much about in terms of COVID. That also fits into what you were saying about this nationalism around vaccines, because we're not seeing a lot of vaccines sent there. What is the situation for countries in Africa?
Yep. It's been interesting because a lot of us who talk about the developing world were predicting a huge rise in COVID cases and a real disaster in emerging markets. Now, that hasn't quite materialized. The rates aren't as high as I think most people would have predicted 6 or 9 months ago. And it's a little bit of a mystery. So here are the theories. One hypothesis is there's just less testing. There are a lot of cases there's just less testing. Another hypothesis is people by and large don't live as long anyway. They die younger. And since COVID-19 was a disease that unfortunately took a lot of elderly patients, if you're in Africa and your life expectancy is 50 or 60, something else is going to kill you before COVID does. That sounds horrible, but in a way, that's partly why you haven't seen the huge case rates. You talked about the vaccine response, and we talked a little bit ago about the revenge of the nation state. This is where it's really evident. So there is an international vaccine alliance called Gavi. They have collected a huge amount of money. I won't know the amount, but in the billions, to help vaccinate emerging markets. And they actually have big commitments. Like I know one company that's done really well on this is Johnson & Johnson. It's just one shot. It doesn't need the extreme cold storage that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines need. And so it's actually very well suited to pushing that into markets that may not have those cold storage chains. And they were wonderful right in the beginning and spread the doses they were selling pretty evenly. They're doing it all on a nonprofit basis. And they also said, okay, we're going to sell a huge amount to Gavi and elsewhere. So you're going to see this ramping up pretty soon. But in the meantime, the West, especially the countries that help develop the vaccines, are saying, well, let's deal with ourselves first, and then we'll help everybody else.
Wonderful. That's really helpful to hear. I'd like to switch gears now, and I'd like to talk a little bit about perhaps one of the biggest issues in U.S. foreign policy, which is China, U.S. relations with China. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about where you think Xi Jinping might be taking China politically and economically in the next 10 years. This is, of course, something on many people's minds.
It is on everyone's mind. I mean, I'm just amazed at how much China is on the front pages every single day. And I'm glad that we're talking about starting with how is China doing internally, and then maybe we'll move to U.S.-China relations. But Xi Jinping has been a sea change for China. We haven't seen a leader like this in China since Mao Zedong. And of course, you're a historian. Mao Zedong was the first leader of China when they came out of their revolution in the late 1940s. He did do a lot of positive things in terms of development, helping women, being more egalitarian, but he was a horrible leader, great leap forward, cultural revolution, millions and millions of people died. Xi Jinping has concentrated power in his own hands in a way that we haven't seen since Mao. So China is run, as you know, by the Chinese Communist Party. And normally that's done through a committee. It's called the Standing Committee. And so that was really put in place after the Cultural Revolution and after Mao, when they said, we don't want these excesses anymore. We're going to have kind of a group of people ruling by committee. Well, Xi still has that standing committee, but he is the clear leader and everyone else is subordinate. All of the leading groups, which is how policy gets created in the Chinese system, are run directly by him. And so when I talk about this at Stanford and elsewhere, I like to liken it to the Chinese system is like a glass. It's authoritarian, it's rigid. And so you never quite know what's going to happen. You can tap it 100 times and nothing happens at all. Tap it just the right way and it shatters. So no one really knows, is Xi Jinping really going to be in power for the rest of his life? That's certainly what he says he wants to do. But are there machinations happening underneath, where in 5 years, 6, 7, 8 years, you see another leader rise to the top because he's just being too tough? You could very well see that. So that's on the political side. Also, the crackdown on anti-corruption is still happening. Some of that was very, very important. And when you talk to the Chinese senior official who's leading that, he sort of stiffens visibly. He's a very pro-Western, very erudite, smart man. But he says, this is what we have to do, the anti-corruption campaign, to make sure that the Chinese Communist Party can rule for another 100 years. So that's what all this is about. It's about rejuvenating the Chinese Communist Party so it can continue to rule. And I think when you look at China, you have to look at it from that perspective. Let me say a little bit about the economy of China, because we're all, of course, very worried about China as a competitor. They are too worried about us. But I think it's important for us Americans and Europeans, Westerners sometimes, to keep in mind that there are a lot of challenges still happening in China, and they're not just fixated on us every minute. They've lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in a really impressive way, but there are still huge income disparities. So what you've seen over the past few years is really the Chinese push through more of a social safety net, more health insurance, revamping the pension systems, all of those things that they need to keep their economy growing. And I sometimes like to compare this to India. President Anderson was nice enough to mention my book, which was about India and China. I had the chance for that to research both and spend a week in the Delhi slums. And I wasn't allowed to go in, but a grad student was nice and helped me with Chinese migrant workers who work in the big factories that manufacture, the smartphones that are in all of our pockets. And urban poverty looks very different in those. So in the Chinese, you'll live in a dorm, 8 people to a room, 10 people to a room, but you have electricity, heat, a rec room with a ping pong table, and a paycheck. So when the Chinese government wants to ramp up its social safety net, as it's starting to do, they could do that because people are in the formal economy. In India, when you go to an Indian slum outside of Delhi, people are not in the formal economy. Almost 90% work outside of it. So the folks that I spent several days with in Delhi were trash pickers. They would every morning climb a trash heap that's 3 football fields tall, collect the recyclables and sell them to recyclers for a few rupees. No electricity, sometimes pirated electricity, but no running water. Very cohesive community, very clean, but they don't have paychecks. So it's much harder for the Indian government to reach them and help them. So I just say some of that because we focus so much on China and all of the aggressive things they're doing on the world stage, but we sometimes don't focus enough on what's going on inside there.
Right. And a growing middle class there and all of those sort of dynamics.
Right.
Well, recently, Secretaries Austin and Blinken met with the Chinese in Alaska, and I wanted to see what you thought about that and how you think the relationship might evolve under the Biden administration. What is China looking for in its relations with the United States? What is the United States looking for in its relations with China? Where do you see this going under a Biden administration?
Yeah, in a word, China is looking for the Biden administration to roll back all of President Trump's policies, and they're not going to get it. Even before President Biden's inauguration, I was part of some what's called Track 2 dialogues with senior Chinese officials. And we heard this drumbeat over and over again. Well, okay, let's just roll everything back to early 2017, and then we can start over. And all of us in the know would say, to the Chinese, in all friendship, what you don't understand is that the aggressive actions taken by President Xi and the Chinese against the Uyghurs, against Hong Kong, which we can talk about in a minute, but which was really extreme. They basically, Hong Kong is ceasing to exist as a separate entity. The aggressiveness in the South China Sea and everything that's happening with not a level playing field for US companies. The Chinese don't have a lot of friends left in the US. It used to be that CEOs who want to do business with China would run into any administration, whether it was Obama or Trump or now Biden, and say, no, please keep doing business with China because that's great. They don't do that anymore because they haven't been able to succeed in the Chinese market. And so the Chinese aren't getting what they want out of the Biden administration. And you saw that very clearly with the fireworks, with the senior Chinese officials and Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken across the hall. And there was a lot of grandstanding. That was basically this, mind your own business and we're doing nothing wrong in Xinjiang. Stop criticizing us internally. And please just roll back everything your predecessor did and then we can start over. And the US side said, I don't think so. Because as you know, because you spent time in Virginia and Washington and elsewhere, very little unites people in Washington, D.C., but these days being hawkish on China is one of them, right? You have Republicans to Democrats, members of Congress across the ideological spectrum. Everybody wants to be tough on China. So I think the relationship you're going to see is one where we try to manage our differences as much as possible. Nobody wants a war. Nobody wants a blow up. We can talk about that in a minute. But so far, the Biden administration, in my view, appropriately, has said not so fast. We're going to be tough. And we're not, you heard Catherine Tai, the new US trade representative, say, we're not going to just roll back these tariffs yet. We have leverage. Good negotiators keep their leverage. And let's see if we can have a real negotiation. And so I think you'll see things change in tone, like you've already seen a calmer tone. You're not going to see probably calling for regime change, which the Trump administration sometimes got quite close to, saying, the Chinese Communist Party has to go. But you will see more competition than cooperation, calling the Chinese out on human rights issues, calling them out on what's happening in the South China Sea, more coordination with our allies on what we can do there, calling them out and trying to compete with them and standing the US up in terms of how to compete with Chinese technology and make sure the US and the West stays in the lead. And then a little bit of cooperation, mostly on climate change and on the pandemic. But even there, we keep saying we're going to cooperate on those things, but you can see the cracks. So, you know, the WHO just came out with their report on the origins of the pandemic. It's pretty clear that we're not getting the full story. And the Biden administration has been, I think, appropriately tough on that. And on climate change, yes, we both want to do the right thing here, but that's going to mostly take the form of us pushing the Chinese to do more.
How does this fit in with the rest of Asia? What is the story there, thinking about China's position in a larger Asia, the US thinking about its other relationships with other Asian countries, and other allies in the region, right? You are an expert on India as well as China. How does India fit into this and the growth that India is experiencing? What is the situation there in terms of the big picture of US Asia? And I mean, Asia, Southeast Asia, other parts of Asia. How does that picture unfold in this current moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So putting India to the side for a minute and just looking at East Asia, this new competition between the US and China sits uncomfortably with them because their economies are so dependent on trade with China. I think China is the largest trading partner of, I'll get my numbers not quite right, but something like 60 countries in the world, twice as many as have the US as their largest trading partner. So there's a lot of economic interdependence, even with Asian countries where there's no loss with the Chinese, no love loss with the Chinese, like South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. Their economies are hugely intertwined. So nobody wants a full break. No one wants a full decoupling. No one wants a war. Those are all positive things. We should want that. And to the extent that the US is pushing people to take sides, that's going to be very hard, and we may not like the answer we get. Having said that, most of our friends in Asia that I speak to are increasingly concerned about Chinese aggression in exactly the same way we are. So all of those things that I listed, human rights, incursions in the South China Sea, in India, huge Chinese incursions over the Himalayan border, where there are almost no roads, but the Chinese are building up their bases way up there. And this last summer was the first time you had deaths along those borders. You know, they're not allowed to use, our audience should Google sometime, just clashes in the high Himalayas. They're not allowed to use weapons because otherwise you would have a war pretty quickly. But the people who died last summer were beaten with clubs and pushed off a cliff, right? And people died, you know, we hear mostly from the Indian perspective. So we believe that the Chinese were the aggressors, but it's apparent that Chinese soldiers died too. So this is really terrifying. Just staying on the military for a moment, Taiwan, of course, is the breakaway province when China, after World War II, became an independent country. Taiwan, of course, became a democracy. And it has had this status that we've maintained for 30 years, where we say there's only one China, but we don't say which one it is, right? We don't have formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan, but we sell them a lot of arms. And that status quo has held. And it's now a little bit dangerous and precarious. So after what happened with Hong Kong 2 summers ago and last summer, the Taiwanese reelected in a landslide Tsai Ing-wen, who's wonderful. She's a very thoughtful leader, but she's more, not all the way pro-independence, but she is tough on China. She's not about reunification. At the same time, you hear some of Xi Jinping's and Chinese leaders' speeches saying, well, the reunification of China is imminent, and at some point we're going to do that. That sounds very scary when you're right across the Taiwan Strait. And you have now, I'm amazed that the news hasn't really covered it, but you have mainland Chinese planes doing incursions into Taiwanese territory almost every day. I was just looking this morning and it was 10 planes yesterday, 20 planes 3 days before, which is the largest. So they're just testing this all the time. And if you think about, I hope it doesn't happen, but if you think about what could be one of the first crises, foreign policy crises that the Biden administration faces, it could be a crisis between Taiwan and China.
Absolutely. We actually, I have some other questions I'd like to ask you, but we had some questions from the audience that are very much related to this topic. So I wanted to go ahead and introduce those if that's okay. We have a question from Darby Stacy about the situation in the South China Sea. They want to know what is going on there. Can you give our audience just a little bit of detail? It's very much related to what you've just been talking about. So it seems like a good time to bring it in.
Perfect time to bring it in. I wish I had a map. The South China Sea is disputed territory. It juts out of China in what the Chinese, they call it the 9-dash line. And if you look at it on the map, it is basically thousands of kilometers of a tongue-shaped protrusion in the ocean of the Chinese mainland. And when you ask the Chinese about this, they're not joking, right? They say, this is our backyard. And I remember one conversation I had a few years ago with a Chinese military official in the PLA. And we were talking about how the Chinese are building military installations on these little atolls, kind of non-existent islands that exist in the South China Sea. And he responded to me, why wouldn't you build a fountain in your own backyard? So this is really non-negotiable for the Chinese. And the people they're infringing on are smaller states. So it's the Philippines, it's Indonesia, it's Vietnam, and they're pushing back, but in a way that we just talked about, they're also dependent on China for trade. And the Philippines has had a government that's pretty close to China, pretty comfortable with China. And so you have this kind of swimming back and forth of Duterte of, are you pro-China, are you pro-US? And you've had the US now. The Obama administration stopped it for a while, but then towards the end of the Obama administration, we were doing what's called freedom of navigation operations, where we sail our military ships through that area just to say, this is international territory. It's not yours, China. And we're starting to get, the Australians are doing some of that. I know the Brits are thinking about doing it too, or may already be doing it. And those operations have accelerated. Not that we want to own the South China Sea, but that we're saying, not so fast, this isn't yours. And the danger there probably isn't an intentional war, because let's be frank, in the end, is the US really going to go to war over a bunch of atolls? I think it would be difficult to mobilize us as a democracy. But you could imagine very easily a miscalculation where the Chinese send in fishing boats or Coast Guard ships to harass American and other Navy ships. You can imagine an accident happening. And so our Pacific Fleet commanders for multiple administrations, this is totally nonpartisan in Washington, have tried to create standard operating procedures with the Chinese to say, if there's an accident, what are we going to do here? And it's been really hard to get that. And I'll just tell you an anecdote for how dangerous this is. Long time ago now, at the very beginning of the Bush administration in 2001, one of their first crises was that the Chinese were hot dogging and accidentally brought down a US spy plane and had the pilot captured. And Condi Rice says for 3 years, she couldn't get the Chinese, for 3 years. For 3 days, she could not get the Chinese foreign minister on the phone. They finally tracked him down at a barbecue somewhere in Argentina. But that's a problem when you're managing an international crisis, because that's how things can escalate out of control, even though that's not what anyone wants. So that's really the worry about South China Sea and the East China Sea, which are the disputed islands with Taiwan, and increasingly the East China Sea, which are the disputed islands with Japan, and then increasingly what's happening in the Taiwan Strait between Taiwan and China.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many incidences from history where you're in a situation, there's miscommunication, there's not enough information, and boy, it gets very dangerous very quickly. So that's really helpful to hear. We have one other question here about China that I wanted to read from our audience. Peter Jimenez asks, he says he worked for 25 years at NASA, and he was wondering if you could share any insight into how the Biden administration might shape future space policy with current International Space Station partners and China and India. So bringing that into the story here, taking it from the ocean up to space.
Yeah, that's such a great question, and I'm unfortunately I think the gentleman who asked the question probably has a better in-depth knowledge of it than I do. I know that there's been some cooperation with the Indians and others on space. There's been some competition with China. You saw that Trump actually set up what they're calling the Space Force, which is grandiosely named, but the idea here is to make sure that all of the satellites that we have in space that help, do the communications with our troops and others are actually secure, because the Chinese are creating anti-satellite weaponry, as anybody would, because that's a vulnerability for us. So I don't see a lot of cooperation, but I think the question was about peaceful space cooperation. I don't see a huge amount of cooperation between China and the US, although I think it would be nice. I have to tell you, even in part of a number of US-China tech study groups, how do we compete effectively? And one of them was with some deans of engineering. And one of the gentlemen said to me, even at the height of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, this gentleman, Artie Bieningstalk, was doing basic fundamental science research on physics with Soviet scientists. And so to the extent that we can keep some of those going, whether it's cooperation in space exploration that helps everyone, whether it's basic science, not necessarily applied science, but things that help humanity as a whole, the more we can do that with China and exercise our muscles of cooperation, in my view, the better.
I'd like to turn now to another real hotspot in U.S. foreign affairs, which is U.S. relations in the Middle East. Each administration says that they want to extricate themselves from the various conflicts, but the U.S. remains stuck. What do you think the Biden administration is going to do about this? Is there an opportunity here for the United States to extricate itself? What do you foresee?
Yeah, we're largely out in a way that's a little bit dangerous. Just kind of zooming out on the Middle East, I think for our friends watching in the audience, I see this as fissures that have existed for decades that have finally broken open. So you're a historian, you probably know this well, Lauren, but after World War I, Sykes and Picot, the French and the British, drew some very arbitrary lines in that part of the world. Usually in the international system, when the borders are straight, you probably have a problem. There's a lot of that in the Middle East without a lot of sensitivity to two different tribes, to whether it was Shia and Sunni. And so you have Shia populations stuck, ruled by Sunnis, and in some cases vice versa. And all of that has just cracked open since the Arab Spring. And I think you have to look at all of the conflicts that you're seeing: Iraq, Syria, where of course Iran and others are meddling. You have to see all of the conflicts kind of in that light. People think, why does Saudi Arabia care about Yemen? That's part of the Shia-Sunni conflict. So there's a lot going on there. The United States, in my view, hasn't covered itself in glory in that part of the region. We really intervene and then we don't intervene. We're very hot and cold. We haven't had a very consistent policy. And it's really complicated. So I empathize a lot with the people, whether it's Trump administration or Biden administration, have to think through, what do we do now? Do we keep a limited presence in Iraq and Syria just to make sure that you don't have ISIS overrunning everything again, like you had at the end of the Obama administration? Do you pull us out because in the end, we're not solving the problem? We're just, keeping the boiling at a certain temperature. A colleague of mine from Stanford called Brett McGurk has just gone back into the Biden administration. He's done that in 3 administrations. And so he's highly knowledgeable, but this is really, really thorny and is going to be resolved probably within a generation. That doesn't mean we'll be there for a generation. but this isn't something that's going to sort itself out quickly. Let me just give an optimistic note about the Middle East, because there's very little. I do think what the Trump administration did with the Abraham Accords was enormously positive. And you can see the Biden administration kind of doubling down on it rather than pulling out. So what this is last year, it was really initiated by the United Arab Emirates and the US to say, okay, the UAE, Sunni Arab Kingdom, is going to just make peace with Israel. We're done with this. This doesn't make any sense. And then Bahrain followed suit, Morocco, a couple of others, Saudi Arabia, the big one, of course, obviously hasn't yet. But it's becoming much more, and when I was in the Middle East just before the pandemic started, and you could already see people from both sides being excited. I have Israeli venture capitalists calling me up saying, oh, do you know anyone in Bahrain and the UAE? We really want to invest in some of their little tech companies. And all of that can only help the region. More economic prosperity, more development that's away from oil, right? Both helps the planet and helps those societies be stronger. So I just wanted to point that out as an area of hope.
Excellent. So that's an area of hope, an area of agreement. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about Iran and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, because that's an area where we're seeing a little bit more of a contentious situation with the last administration, and maybe thinking about what that might look like under the Biden administration.
Yep, absolutely. So the JCPOA, of course, was an agreement negotiated under the Obama administration. The goal was to rein in Iran's nuclear weapons capability. It did not speak to the two other problems that the world has with Iran, which is their missile program and their meddling through Hezbollah and others in the affairs of other states in the Middle East. So Iran, of course, Shia, okay? A lot of the states, they're Sunni. Hezbollah does a lot in Lebanon and Syria and elsewhere, and they cause trouble, right? So the argument of the Obama administration was, well, let's just solve this one problem and then we'll get to the other two. I think many Republicans in the US would say, well, what's the point? Now you're rewarding them for this one thing, and you're giving them, you're lifting the sanctions, and you're going to build up the Iranian economy, and that means they can cause even more trouble without coming out on one side or the other of that. That's kind of where we currently are. President Trump, of course, pulled us out of the JCPOA and reimposed sanctions, really, really tough sanctions. Biden campaigned on saying, no, this is crazy. No matter what else happens in the Middle East, you do not want Iran to have nuclear weapons, because then everybody else will have them too. Big problem. And so now we're stuck. And it's interesting to me that we haven't heard much about the JCPOA. I think it's partly because everyone there is kind of what you and I discussed in the very beginning. People are just getting in their seats, if you will, and everyone's drinking at the fire hose, and China is front and center, and COVID and getting ourselves back on our feet is front and center. But I think you'll hear more about it soon. I don't know how you get easily back into the Iran deal. And I've been pretty encouraged. The Biden administration hasn't just reached out to Iran and said, let's get back in, and squandered all their leverage, if you will. And it's also very thorny to figure out, how would you actually do it? These sanctions are now in place. It's hard to pull them off. A lot of our allies are happy to have them on. So I think this is going to be a longer and slower process than maybe we would have thought during the campaign.
I mean, that's what's often so interesting about studying the history of US foreign relations, is how thorny it becomes to solve some of these problems, right? How do you actually go in? You're often in a situation where there aren't many good choices.
Yeah.
We have some really interesting questions from the audience, so I'd like to go ahead and transition to talking about some of those.
Right.
We have a question.
Hey, Lauren, can
Yeah?
I just stop you right before we go into the questions? Because you just raised such an important point, which is how thorny it gets when you're actually there, and how much that differs from the campaign rhetoric. And, I worked in the State Department now over a decade ago. And one of the things that struck me is how many things in our foreign policy plug along somewhere in the common sense middle. And even though people are screaming on the campaign trail, on day one, I'll do this, on day one, I'll do that. Then you get there, you're like, ooh, this is more complicated than anticipated. And I think that's actually a good thing. So you move towards kind of a common sense and a more moderate approach.
The bureaucracy really does matter. Having people and having career civil servants in the State Department really matters. And that's something we talk a lot about in my foreign policy classes. Yeah, absolutely. So we have some questions here, which touch on topics that you raised earlier. So we have a question from Steve Leach, who asks, how will the Biden administration avoid turning African countries into proxies for great power competition? And this, of course, goes back to some of the larger issues that you were talking about in terms of competition with China, thinking about the Belt and Road Initiative and others, and also, of course, that question of vaccines. So I'd love for you to talk about that question of how might the Biden administration avoid turning African countries into proxies for great power competition?
Yeah, thank you so much. These are such great questions. Thank you to all of you audience out there for staying engaged and being interested in these issues. It's pretty important to the future of our country. So there is a little bit of a great power competition, not quite in the way that you saw between the Soviet Union and the US during the Cold War with proxy wars and people sending arms to Angola and to one side or the other, but it's starting to happen. And I think what the questioner was referring to is China's Belt and Road Initiative, where they are giving loans, almost no grants, but huge, like up to $1 trillion total in loans to developing markets for infrastructure, roads, railways, football stadiums, electricity grid, and increasingly the digital Silk Road. So huge subsidies for Huawei and others to put the telecommunications infrastructure in Africa and Latin America and other countries so that 5G runs on Huawei. Now, this isn't all nefarious. I think the US at first underreacted and then a little bit overreacted to this. So first no one was talking about it. Then suddenly it was, Belt and Road is evil and it's horrible. It's not great. I would just say there's one positive, which is if the roads are smoother and there's more electricity, that's a good thing for everyone, okay? It also, I think the Belt and Road has in it a little bit the seeds of its own destruction. And the story we get in our newspapers hasn't quite reached that yet. So a few years ago, if I would travel to Africa and Latin America, all anyone wanted to talk about was China and China's largesse, and China was so amazing. They don't say that anymore. Now they say, oh, wow, well, that past president was really corrupt. And we have this huge white elephant problem, like the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka is a perfect example. There's not much happening there because it didn't make sense to put it, got put in the district of the president at the time who was really close to the Chinese. Not great, right? So a lot of wasted money. And as I said, it's loans, not grants. So the interest rate on those loans are getting more and more expensive, and more developing countries are saying, is this really what we want to do here? Is this right? And then the question was about great power competition. We can't really compete. Like, we're just not going to lend $1 trillion to countries that are bad credit. No strings attached, right? So you're going to also see a little bit of China losing its shirt. You saw that already a little bit during COVID, where people can't pay. And if it's a local dictator, they're really going to pay China back? Maybe not. A lot of loan forgiveness. Where I do think there's a real competition is over the digital Silk Road. So it started with 5G, but it's also everything that comes with it, which is teaching other authoritarian regimes around the world how to surveil and repress their own populations. It's a big problem in Central Asia and some African countries. The Chinese are really actively doing that. The social credit system, exporting some of the things that we really don't like about the Chinese regime, not because they want to turn, and this is where the Chinese are so different from the Soviet Union. They're not looking to convert these countries into a bunch of little Chinas. But what they are trying to do is say, well, why don't you vote with us in the United Nations against the US and others? Why don't you, help China push its vision of the world? So it's there. And I think the Trump administration woke up to it The Biden administration is going to continue that work. And some of it is around governance and around saying, look, we really don't want to do this. Some of it is about creating alternatives to Huawei and 5G and elsewhere. So we're on it. And there is a competition, but it doesn't look like the Cold War.
Yes, that is the thing I so often say is we're not looking at a new Cold War situation. It's the dynamics with Russia and China are just simply very different than they were earlier. Absolutely. So we have another question here from the audience about the World Health Organization. And the question is, what should the US's policy towards the WHO be moving forward? Did you get the sense that the previous administration had strained those relationships, and maybe thinking about the WHO, maybe connecting it to some of the priorities of the Biden administration in terms of COVID response?
Yeah. The previous administration did strain the relationship with the WHO. We got out of it right? In the midst of a pandemic. Now, international organizations are not perfect. They never are. They're only as good as the political will of their various members. And then layer on top of that, they tend to be pretty bureaucratic and slow moving. And you saw that with the WHO, you see that elsewhere. My firm belief is that it's much better to have international organizations and for the US to be engaged than for us to pick up our ball and go home, because they're not going to go away. And if we have no influence, and if we're not members, then China will, or other people will, Russia will, other people whose views on international organizations we may not like. So I have a very strong bias towards staying in these organizations, complicated as they may, and in some cases holding their feet to the fire. So the WHO was a little soft on China, and sometimes it's hard if you're a little international organization and you're pushing back. They should have been harder on them with the coronavirus in the beginning. There was a huge cover up. We all know it happened. I thought the Biden administration has very appropriately said, not so fast. There's this WHO report on the origins of COVID, and they said, we're just going to take another closer look at this, because some of our intel says something that sounds like it's a little bit conflicting. But overall, yes, you want them there. You want one organization that's going to be in the lead for gathering, for example, money for Gavi for vaccines for the rest of the world. They led the Ebola response. Ebola wasn't a world pandemic in large part because the WHO and others were there preventing it with our help. So overall positive, but yes, of course, they're imperfect.
And staying in, as you note, staying in these supranational or NGO organizations, it does provide you with leverage that you don't have if you leave.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
We have a question here from Homero Garza, who asks, is there a danger of China claiming the dark side of the moon?
I do not have an answer to that.
Yeah, there are lots of interesting questions about space and space exploration, which is really, that someday will be the sort of new frontier of foreign policy, I suspect.
I mean, there is a lot of conversation around, I live in Silicon Valley, where people have sometimes crazy ideas, sometimes wonderful ones, but a lot of idea about mining on the moon and on asteroids. I'm not sure we're quite there yet enough to worry about it for an ordinary foreign policy practitioner. But yes, we should be moving. We should be watching all of these waves of the future.
Absolutely. We haven't talked very much about Europe. And I would love to get, just as we have just the last few minutes here, I'd love to get some sense from you about what you suspect the dynamic will be between the United States, the UK, and the EU going forward in the context of Brexit. Now that the Britain is out of the EU, I'd love to have some final comments on that.
Absolutely, it is a very complicated triangle. So I think Boris Johnson lost a pretty close ally when President Trump wasn't reelected. And you don't see the Biden administration rushing into a new trade deal with the UK just because we're distracted. Not because we wouldn't want to, but we're just distracted. We've got other things on our mind. And so the US holds all the leverage in that. I was not a fan of Brexit, but now that it's happened, glad that they're finally pushing it through. but you see behind the scenes so many little things that weren't decided. So when you look at academic studies, they think the UK GDP is going to suffer between 1.5 and 4%, 4.5% total decline because of Brexit. This is a costly thing. And maybe it helps. I mean, it certainly helps in a few ways. The UK could be much faster and more nimble on the vaccine rollout. That's a real victory. You know, the EU was slower, bureaucratic, spent months negotiating the price of each shot. And as a result, a friend of mine just texted me who lives in Vienna. She said they've just opened the vaccines to people 90 years old and older. You sort of think, get it? Right? I know, Lauren, you were saying in Texas, it's pretty much open to all adults. In California, we're there soon. So that's a real disadvantage. Overall, I'm glad that the EU and the UK will muddle through. They'll be fine. And if you look at this trade agreement that came out, largely it avoids the hard border in Ireland. That's a good thing. Mostly it's free trades of goods. It has some immigration restrictions. It gives the UK regulatory autonomy that they needed and wanted. So this is going to be okay. And the triangle, US, UK, Europe will be fine too. You know, I'm part of a group of senior Europeans and Americans thinking through what can we do to align ourselves more closely with Europe on China policy. Because, you know, in the Trump administration, that was a big thorn in the side of the relationship. The Europeans felt browbeaten by representatives of President Trump going around saying, no Huawei, right? Without saying, well, what else are we going to do? And actually, we're advocating on behalf of European companies, Ericsson and Nokia, and not being consulted. And so there's some assumptions and differences we need to work through there. I'm struck in these conversations with the Europeans, how angry they are at American tech firms, how they really see it as a violation of their sovereignty. And when you say, well, what can we do to cooperate tech competition with China? Should we harmonize our export control regime? Should we make sure that all of our semiconductor industries are positive and working together? They say, not so fast. We want to tax Facebook, Google, and Amazon. We want content controls to be better. So there are thorns in the side of the relationship that need to be gradually ironed out. But we'll get there. They're our closest friends.
So you have hope there.
I do.
Do you think the EU is going to come out of COVID-19 stronger or weaker? I mean, again, thinking about these economic challenges.
Weaker.
Yeah.
So the fact that the vaccine rollout has been so slow means you're not seeing it quite yet, but you can imagine in a couple of months, most American, British, Israeli, Middle Eastern, UAE, Bahrain, Saudi they're also really fast on the rollout of the vaccines. Asia is already roaring. So you're going to see this lag in how fast the EU economy can recover, like those poor hotels everywhere. If you have another summer of not being able to have foreigners travel there. You know, my husband and we're both European Americans. So we were actually visiting family last summer, and you know, there was no one there. They were only Europeans. There were no Chinese and Americans, who are the ones that really keep the tourist industry afloat. So you're really going to see a lag in the economic recovery. And as we talked about, we're coming full circle now. You know, the revenge of the nation state, people sort of said, well, maybe we don't need Schengen always. Well, maybe we should be, not that the EU is going to split up over this, but I think everyone's going to take a step back and say, is this something where I want to give all control over this part of my country to Brussels, or would I retain that? So
lots of interesting developments for us to track over the next few years as we see the Biden administration try to tackle some of these really difficult issues, and also just us as observers watching the world scene. There's a lot for us to keep our eyes on. I think that brings us to about 1 o'clock. I don't know if you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience, but I've really certainly enjoyed the conversation. I learned a lot from you, and I know the audience appreciated your answers to their questions. So thank you.
Thank you. You were such a wonderful moderator. I'm really happy to have met you through this. And to all the audience members out there, thank you for being so engaged in foreign policy. And I'll just leave us with these thoughts. You know, it's sometimes felt over the last few years like the US was on the back foot And certainly that's what we hear from China. Oh, it's in decline and what's wrong with our democracy? And, you know, you've got race riots and an economic recession and COVID. We've come back from worse. I mean, Lauren, you're a historian. You know, we've made it through the 1930s and the Great Depression. We made it through World War II. We made it through all the upheavals of the 60s and 70s. I think this is a moment of really rebuilding and rejuvenation for the United States. So I'm really happy to be here with all of you who are also engaged in these important issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Have a great day.
You too.